Today's topic was actually prompted by our discussion last month, which you may have missed. And if you want to see it, you can go. I know it's not that exciting, but you can see the whole script or relive it from the website. We were talking last month about data strategy, and there's a new federal data strategy that is recently released in June, and an action plan that's been released since then. So 2 successive and cumulative policies from across the federal government. And I have the sense that this is going to be very significant to my personal work, and so I was bringing it to people's attention here. But one dichotomy that came up is we've got this national data strategy, or the federal data strategy. Someone, actually it was Colleen, brought up, well, NSF has this Dear Colleague letter, and you can see it in the list of data policies. It's the 3rd one down for NSF. And she brought this up as an example. Maybe this is comparable, some sort of data strategy from the NSF. And I made a distinction. I said, well, really, that's a different topic. And so I tabled it for today's discussion. It's a very important topic, and also what was recommended by Sarah was we do some sort of survey, because when IARPC began, apparently they did these kinds of surveys to get a state of the science. So here we do state of data policy across the federal agencies. In addition, if we get through all of them, I don't know, we need to go successively, but there's also this common framework document that came out several years ago that is different. This is not like the others. So each one of these above are for a given agency, and they come about through some internal processes or interpretations of the various mandates that we get. But the common framework was an opportunity or a challenge to bring all the federal agencies onto the same page as far as observing data. So that, from my understanding, is not observing system data. This is all observations, but to be distinguished from modeling and simulations of the environment. So we're getting some chats here. If you guys want to chime in, ask questions, you should feel free to do that. It's definitely worthy to take a look back, and actually as these new mandates and data, these actual laws like the Evidence Act and the associated Open Data Act come into play and are they're actually law now, and now they're being interpreted and being disseminated down through the federal agencies. As that comes down to our line offices, and we're trying to reorganize and rewrite these data policies to address those needs, it's good to have this kind of this milestone to look at what we've accomplished so far. Many of these were prompted by the Open Data Act, and there was a OSTP memo around the same time, 2014, that required federal agencies with research budgets over $100 million to make their data publicly accessible. So these and other agencies like NOAA have even longer trajectories and links to like the Federal Geographic Data Committee and rules and laws that have been in place since the 90s. So this is a gradual progression, but it's good to have this milestone now and kind of put this survey back in our record. And we can take some time to discuss these and also the kind of direction we hope to be going. So I see someone's playing with their microphone settings. It's okay. Yeah, do you want to say something, Kelly? Okay, so Let's see. I'm just going to look down the list, and I'm going to call on people. So I know, so I'm not lecturing or speaking at folks. Let's start with Colleen, since you brought us this nice NSF Dear Colleague letter. Can you kind of set the scene? Why did NSF write this, and just the main 2 points? I read it, so I could do that, but I thought it'd be better to hear from you.
Sure. So the Dear Colleague letter that was shared just in the text, the chat box by Kelly, this is a very high level Dear Colleague letter. It's kind of way above my pay grade, so I can't tell you how it came about, but I think it was more just thinking about kind of some baseline policies that NSF wants to have for things, for how it's titled effective practices for data, which includes, as you'll see in the Dear Colleague letter, persistent IDs for data and machine readable data management plans. I think to take a step back, one of the points that I made last month about NSF policies and the way that NSF operates as an agency is that it's very bottom up and driven by our scientific community. So every program at NSF, as you guys are all probably familiar with the Arctic Sciences section, so the programs are Arctic Social Sciences, Arctic System Science, Arctic Natural Sciences, and Arctic Observing Network. Every program and program officer will kind of have some of their own policies on how they approach data and practices around data. I feel like the Arctic Sciences section is actually pretty well organized compared to some other sections at NSF, in which we have a Dear Colleague letter, which I just popped into the chat box, which are kind of, we have specific within the Arctic, within the entire Office of Polar Programs, we have specific data archiving requirements. And so if you're funded, for example, by the Arctic Sciences section, it's required that you at least at the very baseline put your metadata into the Arctic Data Center. And we have some representatives from the Arctic Data Center on the call right now, so they can probably answer some more specific questions there. But you can kind of see here's our kind of specific kind of requirements if you're funded under the Arctic Sciences section or the Office of Polar Programs. That being said, again, these are all enforced in different ways. So there are a couple of different places where these policies and these rules are enforced. So one is when you submit a proposal, you need to submit a data management plan that comes in with that proposal. We have a AAAS fellow here, Raleigh Martin, who's doing some really interesting research. I'm thinking about how these are enforced. He has found that, very often do you not, well, let me rephrase this. Your proposal, more often than not, will not be declined because of a deficient data management plan, but often what program officers will do will be to negotiate that if they decide to make an award. But that's kind of one point where we work with PIs on kind of data policies. The other point that we work with, and again, that's going to be program officer dependent. Some program officers are pretty strict about their data management policies and others are not. And then the other place that program officers can really enforce these things are when the PIs, when they've received an award and are collecting data, submit their annual and final reports. And some program officers are really looking for where the data are archived before we're approving those reports. Again, that's program officer specific. I know in the Arctic Sciences section, when a PI is submitting a final report, we're looking pretty closely that there's some mention of a link to the Arctic Data Center in that final report before we're approving it. So that's really, I have some notes here. I just want to make sure I get them all. So again, I think you do have this kind of bottom-up thing in which the policies are kind of moving up the chain. And so that first NSF-wide Dear Colleague letter that you saw are kind of some baseline policies that many of us are trying to figure out how to incorporate in our program, but that it's really up to the program officer to move the kind of data management policies forward for those PIs. And maybe I'll invite my NSF colleagues to add anything if I missed anything, or if you think about the way you approach this differently.
Colleen, I think that was a good summary of how things evolved. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Colleen. And we're not hearing from Robert Delgado.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was starting to speak, but I guess my connection was a little bit faulty. No, I agree with Renee. Colleen gave us a good representation overview of the way the policy is sort of put into practice by our section. There's a little bit of variation in terms of when there are conversations, discussions with PIs, either pre-proposal, during the proposal review, and then post-award with the reporting. And so, yeah, it's a little bit variable depending on particular program. If you look at the Dear Colleague letter closely, my program AON, Arctic Observing, has a slightly more rigorous requirement. And so I need to pay a little bit more attention to, especially during the reporting time, to ensure that those data are made available widely to the community.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I know NSF has been leading in many ways with this, and I appreciate that bottom-up approach because you are encompassing so many different disciplines that it'd be difficult to have kind of a top-down policy. So I can't recall. I mean, who else contributed some of these policies and want to speak to them? I have one I'd be happy to talk about now, but let's let someone else chime in. Kelly, do you remember who sent us these links?
Yeah, I know we got the USGS one from John Pierce, who wasn't available to be on the phone, but I do believe we have a USGS representative if you want to speak to it.
Well, why don't you bring it up? We can take a look at it.
I'm actually really interested in this. I think it was Dennis. Dennis, you're USGS, right? And an ADIWAG representative?
Yes, that's me.
So is this the data policy by which you work?
So this link that John provided is kind of a national data management website. And so it's really trying to consolidate in a way that to make it really available to scientists to kind of understand requirements of data management. There's also a thing called the Fundamental Science Practices, which governs our policies really for our science. But there's also a section regarding how we handle data, and a lot to do with our formal review process. And so that's not shown here, but there are links in and out to those policies on this site.
Yeah, once again, I think USGS, they're leading in many ways. For a long time, they've been leading on geospatial metadata standards, and they're carrying that through here with their described metadata policy here. And it's kind of two-faceted. So one part is the process. You know, they have a data release process. They have standards for review of everything that's being put on the websites. And that's very USGS specific. But then there's also information on here that's generally usable, generally informative to people trying to figure out the data management best practices. So that makes this, I mean, this is really useful for USGS people, but it's often referenced by others who are just trying to put something like this together for their own agency. Or if you're writing, say, an NSF grant and you want to crib some notes off USGS, that's probably not a bad idea. So
I would agree with that. I think there's probably a certain commonality, and for instance, you know, DOIs data management plans. I think there is a lot of commonality, so certainly makes sense to utilize whatever makes sense.
Great. Okay, so I'd be happy to go next if you probably want to bring up my my link. I'll kind of.
Jonathan, before you, can I ask Dennis a question here about the USGS? Thanks. Jonathan, Dennis, so I'm interested, does ADIWIG have its own, what data policies and procedures does ADIWIG use? I know it's an interagency group, but do they have some standard by which they operate?
I wouldn't say they really have policies per se. It's really has been a collaborative group, and with kind of an emphasis on interoperability. I'm thinking back when we were working on exchange of project information and really kind of coming up with protocols to make that happen so that all members could see project information. That was really kind of a first.
Yeah, I can.
What I want to say.
That's a nice
cycle.
segue actually for this this BOEM information, data and information specification. Without, unbeknownst to me, the ADIWIG, the project and the asset level discovery metadata was, we kind of developed that independently here with our study footprint metadata. And study in our vernacular studies an activity that might include multiple components. We want to study the physical oceanography, the zooplankton composition, the salt ocean oriented, of course. And, so you have an ecosystem, you might have different teams working together. And anyways, the idea is the study can incorporate all those different efforts. So there was a need to combine all the publications, all the deliverables from all those different efforts into a single view, a consolidated view that has all this information bound together. So that's our study. And we wanted to create a geospatial feature on top of that that would capture that study area, because even though they're different topically, they'll often be like at the same stations or whatever, the same geographic area. Like Hannah Shoals, for example, that's a very well defined geographic area of importance to BOEM. Got a little static on the phone. Is there someone not muted? Okay, so sorry about that noise. So while this doesn't look like the other policies, it's very focused on making the studies data accessible through the information system that BOEM manages. And the actual policy is not written in open like NSF is providing. This is often written in our contracts and agreements. So we'll require the FGDC metadata. We'll require data deliverables to make data publicly available, but on a contract by contract basis. So what NSF was saying, they're really bottom up on a program level. BOEM, we're really bottom up, like super bottom up. Every project can have its own approach. And that's basically determined by the project team, whoever's the champion for the project internally, and complying with these basic needs for national consistency so we can find that information through SPIS. So, and often we'll be collaborating with USGS, Fish and Wildlife, less often with NSF, but and NOAA, of course. So we'll defer, we'll say, okay, where the other agency, our partner, has data policies, follow theirs. Just make sure you fill out this component here so we can find the study information in SPIS.
Jonathan, just to chime in about the kind of bottom-up nature of NSF and the connection here, I would say that you know, it's program that our data policies are enforced at a program level, but I would say every project really has their own, because they are writing a data management plan and their data are all really different and diverse, that every project will have its own data strategy as well. So you'll have more, if we have projects that are really focused on social science data or indigenous knowledge, there are different protections that need to be put in place. So I think, you know, the enforcement is at a program level, but every project will have its own data strategy.
So I don't know if we have anybody from NOAA. I think we should pick on them for a little bit. I'd be happy to do that if nobody else can speak to it. Kelly, could you bring up the NOAA link, please?
Sure. Yeah, even though Renee and I are technically from NOAA, I don't think we're familiar enough with.
Yeah, let's do that one, EDMC. Okay, I was really just kidding. NOAA has been leading in many respects and has had this environmental data management committee for many years. This page has changed almost not at all since I worked there in 2012. And they've had the data management planning requirement. They've had, I think data access is new since then, but they had a archive appraisal. Data citation is new, but they definitely had the data documentation. And in fact, when I left in 2012, they were already starting to implement ISO metadata across the agency. So that's something that, like for example, USGS is still struggling to do. And so it was having this committee and a strong governance function within the agency to help them meet challenges and deal with change. And they had some really strong leaders like Ted Haberman, who were really advocating for, you know, going to the next best standard. And one of his favorite things to say is the standards are, you know, are always changing. So just as soon as you adopt a standard, get ready to upgrade, because that's about the time frame you need to do that. So it's a constant process. And this is the data management planning. I spoke some about data management planning at the last meeting, and this is my context. So this was initially developed by someone in the National Marine Fisheries Service. His name was Jim Sargent. And at that time, you know, he was trying to wrangle the Marine Fisheries Service. So, you know, they have their science centers and each one had its own IT infrastructure. So super decentralized, and it's very much still that way. But data management planning was a way to get people on the same page without really having any teeth or you know, to ask too much from them. And it's, of course, become, you know, ingrained now as part of anytime NOAA grants funds to any agency, organization, university, it requires this data management plan. It's specific to a project, so it's a lot like what NSF requires. And they have a way, they have a repository to put them in. So I'm not sure if they're machine readable, but do they really need to be? I mean, they're available online, you can read them. And so that's, here we go. So here are a few data management plans. Not that we need to read them, but they probably have hundreds in here. Here are just the examples, the exemplars. So one thing I wanted to point out is there's a lot of duplication of content here. And someone else mentioned that as a positive. Oh, look, you know, we're converging on best practices or whatever. But it might also not be all that great because coming from outside the federal government, you're kind of in a maze of policy here. And you really need to be in tune with your funding organization and what their expectations are. You know, although you might like just try to pick one of these. It's hard to say which one's the best. And so you really have to tailor it to your funding agency. And I think data management planning, since it's at a project level, is a lesser form of data strategy than you would have if, say, we, as across the federal government, tried to organize and put all these policies into one place. But that actually happened. You know, there was a group of folks from USGS, NASA, NOAA. We haven't picked on NASA, but they're in the list here. You know, these are the big environmental science agencies in our government. And they came together and put down these this common data framework. So maybe you'd like to open that. Does anybody remember this, or has everybody seen this? It's March 2016, so. Anyways, it's a fairly, it's a concise document given the subject matter. And it's written, the audience is incredibly large, okay? So it's written for PI. So if you're in this situation that you just got a grant or you're applying for a grant, it tells you, okay, follow these practices in your data management plan, follow these practices in your proposal, and you should be okay. So here you see the representatives from all these agencies. In addition, it states explicitly that this is also for application developers, and you know that's kind of, you know, makes me you know, how do we bridge that divide between scientists and PIs and the application developers? These are two very different audiences. And finally, also the program leads and people who are funding science. So got an incredibly wide swath of audience. It's trying to bring everybody onto the same page. And it can really facilitate the way that this data policy moves forward. And maybe, in fact, this document has already played a role and is part of the reason why we see all this consistency on the things like the requirement for persistent identifiers. You know, that was a relatively recent idea, and yet I see it all over the place. It's like people have really glommed onto these best practices. So either informally, each one of them compared notes and brought those policies back to their organizations early on in that thought process, or it could be a direct result of this document. I don't know. But this is really a good benchmark here for what the best practices were in 2016. So that's, I guess I'd like to open it up for discussion. Does anybody have any thoughts on this?
This is Chris. I do have a couple of comments. One, I'm going to paste in a link to this data management planning tool that, if you're not familiar with it, it was developed by the California Digital Library. And so that they're working with different funding agencies to add the requirements for data management plans for each agency into their planning tool. And that helps investigators come up with the right verbiage that they need when they're submitting their proposal. So that's a good resource. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the policies across these different agencies are, you know, they work well within a given agency. But one scenario that we have run into is we partner with NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, so NCEI, and as part of the Arctic Data Center, we have been working to replicate the Arctic Data Center holdings over to NCEI in order to have a complete copy of the data center's corpus in another physical location that is independent, is in a separately independent agency. So they're under the Department of Commerce. And so one of the things we've run into is the fact that we, in order to accommodate the National Science Foundation's data policy, we have asked PIs to choose when they publish their data and their metadata, we ask them to choose one of two different licenses, either the Creative Commons what is it called? The CC BY, which is their attribution license, where the data are open and available, but if you use them, then you need to attribute, you have to give attribution to the original author, or the CC0 license, which is really just a public domain declaration that there are no limitations on sharing the data whatsoever. And so the problem we've run into is that when we try to replicate the data over to NCEI, they have a policy that says that the data must not have any licensing restrictions at all. And so even that minor attribution restriction is too much for them. And everything must be completely fully open without without restriction, and that is largely based on this Open Government Data Act. And so I think it's something that we should probably think about across the different agencies on what the recommendations are for PIs in terms of what license they choose to apply to their packages when they share them.
Hi, this is Paul Berkman. I have to go briefly, but I just have a quick question. In view of the 2019 June statement from the Office of Management and Budget, are there elements of the agency solutions for data management that are weak or could be strengthened in the federal policy, or that are enhanced in the federal policy?
That's a big topic. I appreciate you have to go, Paul, but let's try to touch on Chris's point first, and we'll take them in turn. Okay, and we can bring that full circle next time if you have to drop off. So the license issue, yeah, definitely, shooting ourselves in the foot there if we don't have consistent licensing practices, and the interpretation of one agency might not be the same as another. So I don't think this common framework touched on the license issue, but I know USGS has dealt with precisely the same problem. And for example, they have these things called the cooperative ecosystem units. And so they'll do work with a university, for example, and they should, and by all means, deserve to receive the data that the university has developed as part of that agreement. But because of USGS policy, similar to that of the NCEI, they're not able to host that data if it has this attribution requirement, or even a more strict one. There's one that says you cannot use this for commercial purposes. And that's the one I was thinking of in this particular case. So there's some thought, especially around protected species. But we don't want people making money off of this protected species data. It can be used for academic settings. That was a great idea from the university setting, but it didn't transfer to USGS, so it couldn't be pulled into their bison, I forget what it's called, basically their biodiversity platform. And that's really a shame, because we need to have that information in the national system for protected species. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and I think we're getting a little legalistic about this. These are questions that lawyers think about and not necessarily data people. So, I mean, it is policy, but these aren't quite the same kinds of policies that, you know, you might think of coming from Congress or whatever. These are really, and maybe we're using the wrong terminology for this. These are just what agencies setting down the rules, how they want to proceed with data management. Or another good term for this is data governance. And it includes some policies for sure, but we're not lawyers here. So what I told USGS in that case is just, you know, find a solution. I don't care. Bring that data in. You have to have it. And unfortunately, I don't think they were able to do it. Okay, so the second question, Paul, are you still on the phone? You maybe had to drop off. No, I see his name there still.
Still here.
Okay. So Paul, yeah, it's going to require some new thinking, and part of the discussion last month was the data strategy is kind of culminating all these new federal laws and mandates, the Evidence Act. They're kind of giving us the framework in which to operate. And they're introducing some significant new concepts like data ethics that haven't been addressed at all by the earth science community. So it's a part we probably should have, but we don't deal a lot with microdata. There's a lot of material on statistical information. We don't deal a lot with that kind of information. But it's now forcing us to look at those questions, and I think it's going to have to change the way these data policies are written and implemented in our projects.
Along those lines, open data in a general sense is an emerging topic of discussion, has been for a number of years. Are there utilities that will emerge as a benefit from the federal data policy in terms of services, for example?
Do you mean utilities like in a, you know, a physical sense, like a telephone pole, you know, the infrastructure for disseminating data?
Data is fundamental to informed decision-making. Data itself isn't evidence. Evidence is in the context of the decision-making institutions, but data itself is a fundamental part of informed decision-making for governance mechanisms as well as built infrastructure. And I would assume, looking into the future, that data policies will ultimately enhance and create the capacity for knowledge economy. So I'm just wondering, in terms of steps being taken, whether you see those types of progress.
Yeah, well, we'd say the terms we use are data assets. So even though the data is not a physical thing, it connotates a physical asset like like the bad example of a telephone pole. These are things that the agency needs to operate, or you know, given a specific context, or you know, arguably that society needs in order to self-regulate. So if we're not making this available, it's going to inhibit our ability to learn from mistakes or to do things better. So yeah, I appreciate that, and yeah, that's right on the money. I think a lot of what's been done and what's represented here in these policies are more on the technical side of, you know, how do we go about sharing information, in a smart way. And then the new policies will help us focus on, well, great, now we have the information available and usable. How do we best make use of that information to improve, whatever, to improve everything that we set out to do? So it's kind of taking us to the next level, I hope. I mean, we'll see how things pan out, but I really think it's going to be a lot different from the last 4 years.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Paul. The multiple topics out for discussion. Does anybody else have a thought?
Yes, I have a question, Phillip Harrison. I've done some beginning literature searches, and how would one search for glacial retreat, not just at the poles, but globally? And I'm sure it's pretty well documented at the poles through various agencies and universities.
Mm-hmm.
But have any ideas on that, or?
Well, I mean, I would ask Google.
That's always a good start.
Yeah. No, I mean, so what you're bringing up is we have these domain-specific repositories, but we're not yet good at transdisciplinary issues that cross regions, cross nations. Those are real challenges. Think about the cross-national issues. We don't speak the same language. So what is glacier in Spanish? How do you write that query? So Google's doing some of that, is trying to normalize the web so you can find things despite these barriers.
Jonathan, if you want, I can chime in too. So I think what Phil is talking about is kind of geared towards like a federated search type situation, which is collating data from across different repositories to be able to find a common theme. In this case, Phil, it sounds like you want to kind of find data associated with glaciers, correct?
Glacial retreat and decline, yeah. Yes.
So that data is obviously going to be all over the place. So I popped a link. There are some efforts being made by the Arctic Data Committee. This is not a federal organization, but it's kind of an international kind of basis. It's being led by Peter Pulsiver, who previously was a co-lead of this team. But there's a working group on federated search for that one. But that's really where we would aim to kind of do something like that. But it's really not easy to do at all for some of the reasons that Jonathan just brought up, given the diversity of data, how they've been collected, the metadata that's associated with them. So yeah, it's not easy right now, but there are some kind of incipient projects trying to help move towards that. And other people on the call might have other ideas too. Okay, thank you. If you could just repeat the name of that organization so I can write it down. Yeah, so it's the Arctic Data Committee. It's a committee under the International Arctic Science Committee, IASC, and the Sustaining Arctic Observing Network, SAON. Their website is arcticdc.org. Thank you.
I don't know if this is helpful or not for that question, because I don't know the field well enough, but there is a glaciers and sea level rise team in IARPC as well. And this is a type of question that they have an upcoming meeting. I can check on the site what the date is of their next meeting, but it is a type of question that you can bring to that team. And theoretically, everybody who's joining that team meeting are going to be in that field, and just kind of sharing this kind of information and struggles that people are having in that field might generate some more information. And I see their next meeting is on August 19th.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful.
Good.
I'm the prince of the obvious. So please don't think I'm talking down to you. But the way this used to work is you go to a library or somehow looked in journals and hopefully someone else already did the compendium, you know, has already done the
compilation. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, if you've already looked for that, haven't come up with anything, then I guess you're it. You have to do it.
Well, there is a publication on, I think, global glacier decline or some inventory type document, but I haven't read more than the abstract. So, but that's, yes, that's the kind of thing I'm looking for.
This is Dennis. I might mention ESIP, Environmental Systems Information Partners. I think that's what it stands for. It's sponsored by NOAA, NASA, and USGS. They meet twice a year, and then they have various groups that talk about different things. So they had their summer meeting last month. I wasn't in attendance, but I did remotely attend a couple of meetings. But this was a topic that came up there as well. And there are groups that are looking at that, kind of looking at, and maybe the folks from Arctic Data Center would know more about that, but it seems they were kind of looking at schemas and how they could work better with trying to influence Google in terms of creating these kind of federated searches that you're speaking about and making them more successful.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Chris Jones. I can address that. Within the Arctic Data Center is, you know, one of a myriad of repositories of data, and we participate and help create the Data One Federation, which is a network of environmental data repositories. So that's at dataone.org, and so the effort there is to try to create interoperability between these disparate repositories by creating a search index that represents common metadata search fields across all of the repositories. And so, and part of that effort is that we are producing metadata in a language that that Google understands as well. So the landing pages that you come to at dataone.org have a particular embedded syntax in them, so that when Google indexes that information, then all of those data sets become available in the Google's dataset search, which is a new service that they have in beta right now, and they're trying to make it easier to be able to search across, you know, all types of scientific domains within their system. So those are some things that you might look into.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for your attention and participation today. That was a really great discussion. We are just at 2 o'clock, so we're going to have to wrap up the call. But the next meeting for the Arctic Data Team is going to be in conjunction with the Arctic Observing Team on August 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Alaska. And so we'll see you then. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.